Hello and welcome to the Storytelling with Puck podcast. We will, as always, start with a story.
The bar. This is a favourite haunt. The big mirrored wall behind the bar bounces light around. Everything is rich and bright. The bottles diving to their optics are shiny, colourful and intriguing, filled with exotic choices. The bartenders in their tall handsomeness glide elegantly around. They have small aprons tied neatly just below their slim waists. The aprons have a pocket at the front containing a bottle opener and their small pads, which they occasionally use to take orders. However, they prefer to demonstrate their prowess by memorising orders, but the pad is there just in case. There is a crisp white towel tucked over the apron strings. One of the bartenders is flamboyantly mixing a cocktail. His every gesture exaggerated. It is a theatrical performance. This drama is partly what draws Karen and her daughter here. They also love the mini acts being played out by the customers. The polished businessmen grouped together, their voices loud and rich with confidence. There are couples too, prosperous men with young manicured and stiffly coiffured jewelled women with nipped waists hanging onto their every word and their thick wallets. Karen stands at the bar surveying the scene. She feels out of place but holds her space. She perches on a brass-studded pale tan leather bar stool. "Here you are, madam," says the waiter, his French accent making the outdated term more palatable. He places two large glasses down on the copper bar. Beneath each is a small folded black napkin. Then a perspex wine cooler containing their favourite bottle of white wine. Just then, Karen's daughter appears at her shoulder. They hug. "Shall I bring the drinks to a table for you?" says the bartender. As ever, the service levels have suddenly increased with the arrival of Karen's beautiful daughter. Bee is dressed in a neat black dress. She is taller than Karen, despite her flat patent moccasin shoes. Her dress has a little Peter Pan collar. "Yes, please, that would be lovely," Karen replies to the bartender. They choose a place to sit. There are 4 tall marble tables in front of a high, long leather bench seat facing the bar. They sit behind one of these tables, placing their bags on the bench at either side of themselves. The bartender appears. With a swift, efficient flourish, he places the small black napkin squares on the table, then the glasses. "Would you like me to pour for you?" says. "Yes, please," says Bee, smiling sweetly. Karen is proud of Bee's confidence, her lovely nature. He pours the chilled wine into the glasses, which quickly mist. The whole process is rich with anticipation of the lovely evening ahead, exchanging stories and gossiping about the dramas on the stage laid out before them. The bartender places the bottle into the wine cooler he's already set down on the table. "Thank you," says Bee. "Could we have some water, please?" asks Karen. "Of course, madame. Still or sparkling?" he replies slightly impatiently. "One sparkling and one still, please," says Karen. Karen asks Bee how her day has been, and they are off. Karen revels in the fact that her children are now grown. They are unhooked from her, and she can talk without responsibility. They are friends. The waiter returns. More black napkins and 2 tall, elegantly slim glasses of water are placed on the table. Karen watches in anticipation as the bubbles bounce around her glass. The cool of the water creates a thin film of condensation around the glass. They resume their chat. Then Karen becomes conscious of the men gathered around the table next to Bee. They are laughing noisily, drinking from large glasses heavy with scarlet wine. The man closest to Bee stays seated but shuffles closer to her. "What do you do?" he slurs. "I'm a solicitor," she replies. "Ah," he leers. "Well, you are very lucky today," he continues, leaning towards her. Karen slides towards the edge of the high bench and looks over to him. "I'm the partner of a firm of solicitors in town." His lips are stained with red wine. His words run into each other. "I bet you don't often get the chance to talk to a partner, do you?" He places heavy emphasis on the word partner. Bee turns towards Karen. Shifting slightly, she turns her back to him. He's unperturbed. "Here's my card," he says, fumbling into his pocket to retrieve the card. "Thank you," says Bee, smiling once again. Karen and Bee talk. Karen does not take her eyes off him. He leans over again and places another card in Bee's bag. Karen feels the anger rising but does not move. Then he leans closer still and places a card in Bee's lap, close to the hem of her dress, which sits about 6 inches above her knee. Karen snaps. She walks around the table and stands in front of him. You seem a bit annoyed, he says, leering and turning his face towards Bee, as if she and he might enter into some sort of conspiracy against the madly flailing mother. He stands up. In doing so, he brings a glass smashing to the floor. The red wine pools on the table, then drips down on top of the shattered glass. Karen returns to her seat. One of the other men at the table nod apologetically in Karen and Bee's direction. They usher their friend into his long black coat. He shuffles towards Karen. He stands in front of her, his large frame swaying. What did I do wrong, he asks. I'll explain to you another time when you're sober, says Karen. She feels a slight thrill of superiority as she's only had a small amount to drink so far. He continues to leer at Bee. Then he is gone. I'm sorry, he sometimes doesn't know when to stop, his friend says to them. I think he's been out since lunchtime. We just joined him an hour or so ago, as by way of mitigation and abdication of responsibility. It's okay, says Bee. They resume their evening.
Wow. What a world. We'll talk about that a bit more in a second. But firstly, thank you, Viv, for reading that. Before we start, a little note to anyone listening for the first time or anyone who has forgotten. My name is Stefano. I run Puck Creations and I am the regular host of this podcast. If the title, Storytelling with Puck, hasn't given it away, this podcast is all about stories like the one you just heard. We will share stories, chat about stories, and see how stories fit in with the business world too. Of course, we couldn't do any of that without our wonderful guests. So let's start properly by introducing Viv Parry. Viv, be amazing and tell us all about yourself.
Thank you, Stefano. It's really lovely to be here. You've kind of started a whole, I don't know, a tidal wave, I think, of storytelling, which is brilliant, and I'm really happy to be part of it. I'm Viv Parry. Yeah, I own a business called Be Amazing, which is, as the title suggests, about just finding the amazing in people and enabling and inspiring that. And it's business related. My background is finance. I'm a chartered accountant, so I also have a role as a finance director in a business. I've also owned my own business for 11 years. I built the bakery business out of liquidation. And I think it's fair to say my biggest passion is growing people and enabling them to grow businesses. So that's sort of where the whole notion of Be Amazing
that
came
makes a
from.
lot of sense. It's an incredible thing that you do. I have listened to some of your podcasts, actually, the Be Amazing at Home podcasts, and the way you interact with people and the way that you ask the right questions, even in those podcasts which you're not doing your day-to-day job. That always seems to me to be able to bring out the best of people, which is a skill, an incredible skill. What is it that makes you want to work with certain people? Who attracts you?
I think people who are a bit quirky and interesting. Okay. I think if people are just ordinary or they're happy to settle for the status quo, they're probably not my kind of people. And I think it's really, it's hard to work that out initially, isn't it? But I think I'm somebody, if I go in to do a piece of consultancy work, I would start off, and I hate that expression, but anyway, let's park that. I would start off by saying, do you want things to change? And if the answer's no, then it's like, see you, goodbye, I'm not for you.
Do people often say no when you ask that question?
Yeah.
Really? That does surprise me. I don't know why it surprises me. I come across it myself too, but I feel like the idea of bringing somebody like you in and then you ask that question, and they say no, it just seems counterintuitive to me.
Yeah, I think probably maybe it comes from my profession, so the accountancy thing. So there are different types of accountants, aren't there? So, there are compliance accountants who come in and just process transactions, produce a set of accounts, blah 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 blah. And there's a place for them, but I'm not one of those. I think about my role more as engineering change, using finance and data.
So is it almost analytical in some ways?
I suppose it's mainly about fueling good decision making.
Okay.
So you can't make a decision if you haven't got the right data. And does your system produce the right data? Yes, no. If it doesn't, let's do something about that. And are you actually able to interpret that data as well? So are you, and there's always that little hole that you can slip down where you can find the right data to prove the decision you want to make anyway. We know about that. But yeah, so that's kind of what really floats my boat, is that, and because I did it in my own business, I understand it and I know what the challenges are, and you can have the greatest strategy in the world, can't you? But then, oh dear, there's people involved in this.
That's a good point, and it's like you were reading my mind. It leads on perfectly to my next question, because people are involved in this, and so analyzing data, working out what to do with that data, and then the best potential that you can have from that data for your business is a skill in itself, and it's definitely not an easy thing to do. But the next stage of doing all that is often persuading people to join you and to agree that the way forward is better because of the data that you have analyzed and because of the work that you've put into it. Sometimes people are very convinced of their own ideas and do not want to shift. How do you go about persuading people of the right ideas, or even just having a chat to make sure that you're comfortable that it is the right idea, I guess? I
suppose I would describe myself as a benevolent dictator. I am. I can you use powers of persuasion, and you try to get people to think that it was their idea in the first place, and that they've made that decision. So I think that's how you do it. You stand back from it a little bit and give them time and space to work it out, and also accept that. So in my current role as finance director, I'm really lucky to work with somebody who is very, very similar to me. So we're the two directors, and we're the decision makers, and we work very, very quickly. But we have to keep telling each other, hang on, everybody's not coming along at the speed we're going at. And you have to sort of learn to give people time to catch up.
I like what you said there about allowing people to also come to their own decisions. Something we do with our clients is we do workshops where we get leadership teams involved in trying to understand their brand, to understand who they are as a company better. Because although we all think we understand our companies really well, until you actually really start asking the right questions, we understand the surface level of what we're doing rather than actually all of the stuff that comes from underneath to help it flow. But one of the big things we do is we get everybody involved in making sure that each voice is heard when we ask questions about what do you think your values are, or, why is it that you're in business in the first place? What ideas of strategy do you have? Because otherwise it can be very easy for somebody at the very top to say, these are our values, this is why we're in business, this is our strategy, you must follow. And the investment isn't there then. The people don't want to follow. Would you find something similar happens with, you come from a slightly different place, but the way you work, does something similar happen if you don't allow people to come up with their own ideas?
Yeah, completely, because they're ultimately they're the ones who are going to have to execute on it, aren't they?
Exactly.
So you need them to be on board. And I think a lot of it is, and this is kind of a learned thing, and I haven't always been like that, it's kind of giving people the time and space to speak. So I do quite a bit of mentoring now, and I really enjoy it. And I think one of the challenges is making sure. So I had a session this morning at 9 o'clock. There's 11 freelancers on the call, and I see my role as monitoring everybody and making sure everybody has an opportunity to speak, because it's dead easy, isn't it, for one person to kind of dominate. So you're kind of listening to one person speaking, but looking at all the others and finding out one who looks like they want to say something and encouraging them to do so. So it's giving people that space, but also properly listening to what people are saying as well. Sort of going, hang on, you've said this. What is that? Was that what you actually want to say, or was there something else? So it's a time thing, isn't it? And we're all very boom, boom, boom. Everything's happening really quickly. So it's dead hard to sort of sit back and go, whoa, hang on, let's just slow down with this.
That's a great point. When you talk about properly listening and trying to understand what's behind what people are saying, I think that's one of the hardest things that any human, not just in business, that any human has to do. Because, as you say, it's sometimes people say what they feel, maybe they think everyone else wants to hear.
Yeah.
But there's something underneath which is trying to get out somewhere. What you suggest in terms of the way you do your mentoring, though, seems to allow lots of different people to speak at the right time. Do you think that hearing other people speak helps people to free up and to be able to then, once they feel a bit more comfortable, because people who are a bit louder in the room maybe have had their chance, it allows them to be free and say what they want to say?
Yeah, it's the sessions that I've done this morning, this is the 8th week of it, and it's all been over Zoom, and you can actually see the change in people over those 8 weeks. And because I was really keen to encourage them to collaborate and sort of think, right, this is our group, this is the power group, we belong to this group, and sort of put them in a couple of short breakout sessions to get them to talk to each other. And the chat box is going like crazy all the time when we're on the call. It's so powerful, and I think it will carry on. Those relationships will carry on. But I think unless you enable everybody, that's not going to happen.
Right. It's brilliant how you work that. And do you come up with specific subject areas, or do you let the mentees come up with the subject areas? How does that work?
Well, it's part of a structured program, so there is a structure there. And I should give a shout out to the program. It's called Freelance Her 100.
Freelance Her 100. Okay, we'll make sure we link to that as well.
Yeah, and it's led by a good friend of mine, Naomi Timperley, who's an absolute legend, absolutely brilliant. So there is, they'll have had a workshop on the Tuesday, so there'll be some specific content in that workshop. But actually what we're doing now that there is that kind of trust and bond between them, we've done like a peer challenge session. So unless they've wanted to talk about the workshop topic, we've just done this, right, here's where I'm at, what does everybody else think? And that was amazing.
That's brilliant. Something which interests me from the perspective of what this podcast is all about, and also how we got to know each other originally. With those sessions,
haven't we always known each other?
Yes, I think it's about 4,050 years that we've been. Yeah, I think that was the date. I can never remember the exact time. Was it midday or 1 p.m.?
Yeah, 1 p.m. I think.
1 p.m. Thank you.
Yeah.
So 1 p.m. 4,050 years ago, when we first met, we were telling stories. Which was brilliant. And I was wondering, when you have these mentee sessions, how much storytelling comes into it, whether or not you actively encourage it or whether or not it just happens. Do you get much storytelling, and does it help with connecting?
Yeah, I think there's loads of storytelling. It's pretty much all storytelling, isn't it? Because if they're bringing a challenge, so you tell the story of what the challenge is. Yeah. And then people probably respond with their own stories. So I had a similar scenario when da 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 happened. So I think it's pretty much all storytelling.
I think that's brilliant, because sometimes you can with this is a slightly different thing because it's a mentoring session, but with mentoring sessions and with any kind of networking session, it's often the case that you get who can shout the loudest about what they do the loudest and what all the different features are. When you have the exchange of stories, to me anyway, that's what connects people on a deeper level, but also it's how you learn. I imagine that, as you say, when somebody talks about a story and then somebody says, oh, actually, yes, I have a story similar to that, and somebody else says, I have a story similar to that, everybody is learning from the mistakes that all of them made, but also how they then came out of those mistakes. Whereas if somebody just chipped in and said, oh, by the way, I bought this amazing pen and this pen solved all of my problems, no story behind it, just I've got a pen that solved all of my problems, who would care?
Yeah, you can't relate to that, can you? Unless you've got a bit of a passion for pens, maybe. I don't know.
That's true. I think our mutual friend who was on some of the calls on the Storytelling with Puck, Alistair Fee, might take something from an amazing pen. He loves pens.
Yeah. Actually, interestingly, a couple of the people in the group have storytelling businesses, and she came with a challenge this morning that actually some of the stories have been very powerful, and she's feeling quite a burden as a consequence. But we had the conversation, and I think you've said it a couple of times in your podcast that storytelling you're not the therapist. It might be therapy to tell your story, but the person listening isn't there to counsel you. They're there to listen. There are people who do that professionally, aren't there?
That's right. Yeah, I think I understand her struggle to an extent, because, as you say, when you have lots of people who are willing to go to sometimes the deepest levels of emotion and share a story, and because you're the person who started up the campaign and gave the opportunity to do it, sometimes you feel like you need to respond. You need to have an answer. You need to have a fix. I've learned over time that it's really not my job to fix anybody's problems at all. I just listen. That's all I can do.
Yeah, I think it's I must connect you with this lady, because you probably have quite a few things that you could share. But I think it's important, because you're almost saying, as the person who kicked off the storytelling, you've kind of given me permission to tell my story, which is great, and thank you very much. But I don't expect you to go, oh, that's good, or I don't agree with that. You've just opened the door, and the rest is down to me then.
I agree with that, and I've learned over time that when you allow people to express themselves, if you make too many comments or too many judgments on it, and I don't get me wrong, I comment on these things all the time just because I'm genuinely impressed or genuinely I have some emotion, and also I just like to talk about the stories and dig deep into them. But if you express your opinion too much about somebody's story, even if it's overly positive, it can cause people to then start second guessing and judging themselves and wondering whether or not it was the right thing to do. So it's a very hard balance to listen to the stories, to talk about them, to dig a bit deeper into them. But at the same time, my opinion doesn't really matter. What I think of your story isn't the point. The point is that you've had the opportunity to release it, and that people have heard it, and that you've got it out of your system. That's something which I feel is part of what connects us, because then some people will relate to your story, and other people who can't relate at all will potentially learn from it.
I think that's the point, isn't it? It's to make people curious and to make people question, and I think it's also for your own personal growth, isn't it? I think Gary, who's on one of your other podcasts, said something about, you look back, not to rip people apart, but to actually inform how you move forward.
Yeah, which was beautifully poetic, as Gary.
He said it in a much better way than I've just said it.
You said it very well too. And, but here we go again. This is where I can't help myself. I'm now given a positive critique of, of the work, but it's a really, really good point. You're not looking back to do anything with it other than to look at it through a magnifying glass and to understand it better. That's the reason for expressing it, which is something I feel like the story you shared with us today, I would love to understand a little bit more about where it came from. So you're mentioning Karen in your story. So Karen is not Viv. So it's clearly a fictional story. But where does the inspiration for a story like The Bar come from? Before Viv digs into her brilliant story and tells us about its inspirations and origins, a quick reminder that you're listening to episode 11 of the Storytelling with Puck podcast. Viv Parry has kindly shared an excerpt from one of her most recent stories, which we'll investigate further very soon. That's all before we eat our way through all of the cakes in Viv's bakery, hear part 2 of The Bar, and get another story from Puck Creations. Remember, I've just asked Viv where her ideas come from.
I suppose what I'm doing is I'm sort of writing some of it from experience, some of it from observation. So you might create a fictitious scene, but you place it somewhere that you've been. So that is the place I describe as a real place.
Okay.
And I think about the line between fact and fiction is it's like colouring in. So you've got a framework and you can shade it in really lightly and you can stay inside the lines and it's still pretty much fact, or you can really colour it in much more deeply.
I love that.
And go over the lines a bit. So it's is it fact, is it fiction? The question is, does it matter?
I love that. Something which we do quite a lot, and I'm not going to go into the story again because I've shared it with you too many times, but people often ask us about Puck Creations' origin story. Where does the name Puck come from?
If people want to know, they can listen to the podcast where you're the guest.
Yes,
on my Be Amazing at Home
idea.
podcast.
Yes, everybody listen to Be Amazing at Home podcast. You don't really have to listen to me if you don't want to. You're probably fed up with my voice by now, but Viv is incredible. So listen to all of her episodes.
We're doing what we do best. We do the loving all the time, don't we?
Let's stop that now. Stop the loving. Viv is horrible now. But when we share that story, the interesting thing about it is that it's half fact, half fiction. But it doesn't really matter, as you say. If we're talking about a goat that speaks, okay, maybe some people do believe that's fact, but I'd imagine that most people don't. But then it leads in to something that did actually happen to actually start off a business. And I feel like that mix and that, as long as you're not trying to con people, as long as you're not trying to make people believe that something happened when it didn't for the purpose of manipulating them, then I think actually that blend of fact and fiction is perfect, because it's what entices people to want to listen to you and to want to understand more about your story and etc.
Yeah, and for me, it's the what happens next that's the relevant thing. So I've told a story. Would somebody potentially behave differently as a consequence of listening to that story? That's the bit that matters, not whether it's fact or fiction.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it was something that I noticed when I was listening to the story, is that we've had a lot of talk about this type of situation recently for very obvious reasons. And it's there's a lot of horrible stuff happening in the world. It's nothing new, but it's been highlighted because of, I don't want to talk about specific cases, etc., but because of some stuff in the news recently. But what you find quite often is then off the back of that, people are very quick to share an opinion, to shout about something really loudly, and to say, this is a fact, I'm right, you're wrong, and vice versa. And I understand why people feel like that. I understand why people want to do that. However, I'm not always sure whether those exchanges are beneficial to anybody. What I find beneficial about your story is that you are explaining a situation, you're talking about a situation, and you're letting people listen and take what they want to take from it. And as you say, hopefully people will learn, but you're leaving that then in other people's hands. You're just sharing a story. Oh, sorry, I'm speaking far too much. I was meant to ask you about that rather than me just say it.
That's okay. That's the point, though, isn't it? That if hearing the story has made you think that, then that's worked, hasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I think the only downside is potentially the people that you really want to hear the story won't hear it.
Even if they listen, they won't hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you don't tell it. Because, you know, I'm the mother of 3 daughters. I actually read this to my middle daughter this week because I was telling her about coming on the podcast and I just wanted to get her thoughts on it. And that's a really powerful force for me, is that, you know, I'm telling this story and I'm standing there and I'm saying this and it's clear what I think about the situation without me actually articulating it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's really important for me, that my girls hear that.
Yeah.
And as a consequence go, no, that's not right. So that they'll call stuff out. Whereas, you know, as I was growing up, I didn't have that kind of protection or I didn't have the codes of what you called out and what you didn't. And it was, you know, it wasn't common currency. And I tell you this story, and this is true. God's honest truth is true. So as I'm going through my training contracts, I was at a client's and I asked a question, which you have to do as part of the audit process. You ask questions of the client. The client in response went, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about that."
Oh.
That is, you know, and we're not talking about a long time ago, are we? And I've got way more stories of horrible stuff. It's much more.
The problem is, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you have way more stories. It's not surprising. It's disgusting, but it's not surprising. Reflecting back on what you said there about explaining to your daughter, though, I like that point. And there's something to the idea as well with stories that when we're telling stories for business, we usually have specific audiences in mind. And that doesn't, we maybe slightly change some aspects of the story to reach those audiences. When we're telling stories for pleasure or for some other purpose, yes, we also have an audience in mind, but often it's just to get something out, get our thoughts and our feelings out. However, we do still have lots of different audiences for our stories and lots of different audiences for our message. So something you mentioned then in relation to telling your daughter that story, I think is powerful, because that's one particular audience who can get something from it. So when you say the people you really want to reach, you're maybe not reaching, but actually one of the people you want to reach, you are reaching. And also something that I thought wasn't subtle in your story, but made a strong point, was the gentleman's maybe not the correct word, the man in the scenario who was next to the leering man and apologized after the fact. What ideas were you trying to portray by including him in the story, but only as almost a tertiary part of the story?
Just the notion that all of that is going on, and actually a different scenario would be that the friend would call him out.
Yeah.
And he doesn't, and that's kind of that's a big part of the problem now, isn't it?
Yes.
that behaviours don't get called out. Or I've written another piece which is based on an experience that I had on traveling on a train, and not an awful experience, but quite not a pleasant one. And it was kind of an early morning train, and I'd set my stall out I'd been and got a book, and I'd got a paper, and I thought coffee, and I thought, oh, this is going to be great. And I'd got my seat, and then this bunch of guys who are going off to a football match, and they've got the can, and this sounds stereotypical, but it's actually this was the scenario. They've got the cans of beer, and they're drinking at 6 o'clock in the morning, blah 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 blah. And I was the only seat in this set of seats that they all had, and I just felt really, really uncomfortable. So what that scenario needs is for one of them to look at me as if I'm somebody that he's related to, a woman in his life, and go, oh, she must be feeling a bit awkward now, and act in a way that protects me.
Yeah.
Whereas they were all too busy being lads.
And didn't take any notice. It's interesting because I think some people will potentially bite at that and say, why is it their responsibility, etc., to have to, stop whatever it is they're doing in their life. But even if you're taking it away from this particular situation, something which I think is a really key learning point from your story, even if there will be people who want to have arguments about the male, the female thing, etc. Even if you take it away from all of that, there's a really simple lesson about being aware. Mm. And maybe that's another audience you're reaching with your story. Mm. Just be aware. Be aware of your surroundings. Be aware of other people's feelings.
Yeah, how other people are responding to you. And I think my other message in the story is mainly that one around, just because you can and you've got the power doesn't make it right.
Yeah. That's a powerful message too. Because we're focusing quite a lot on the story at the moment, you mentioned to me before we started the podcast that there is actually a smaller second part.
Oh, it's a tiny little part.
But I'm sure our listeners would love to hear it. Would you mind reading it for us?
I'd be happy to do so. Thank you. The same scene a couple of weeks later. Karen is waiting at the bar. He appears and stands next to her. Hello, he says. Oh, she says. We know each other, don't we? He asks. Yes, we do, replies Karen. We met years ago. She replies languidly. She's irritated and bored. I just wanted to apologise for the other week, he stutters. You don't need to apologise to me, she replies. But you're in luck because I'm meeting my daughter again, so you can apologise to her. You're also very lucky, Karen continues. Why? He asks. Well, I was going to put something on social media about the other week and name you, but my friend stopped me. I'm glad you didn't. I wouldn't have wanted my wife and my daughter to find out, he says. Maybe think about that before you act like a lecherous prick again, Karen says. He looks at Karen, picks his drink up from the bar and walks away. Bitch, he mutters under his breath. In that moment, Karen knows that her friend was wrong. Can I help you, madam? Says the bartender.
Yeah, there's an interesting addition, and follows on from some of the stuff we've been talking in between part 1 and part 2 of the story. And in that particular situation, it's clear to see that some people don't learn, and the apology is false, and that's always a hard thing because some people do learn also, and some people do change, and some people make mistakes and they are genuinely one-offs, and other people it seems to be part of their personalities.
Yeah, and I think it's I guess the challenge is, and what I wanted to kind of convey with this story is that suddenly he's behaved inappropriately, yet they're left with the dilemma.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's often a question that I see posed which asks something along the lines of, and this is not just with this scenario, but whenever there's a scenario of somebody being oppressed for some reason, or or group of people being oppressed or hurt for some reason, the question of, well, what shall we do about it? And it's asked to the people who are being oppressed or hurt, etc. To an extent, I understand the question, because if you don't know what to do and you're ignorant, then okay, it's hard to change behaviors. But having said that, there's a difference between trying to find out and looking for information to help you decide what to do once you know there's a problem, and putting the responsibility onto somebody who's already been through enough to tell you what to do to fix the behavior, which is you causing someone to be hurt in the first place. And it's a very interesting point, and your story tells it well. What are your thoughts on those kind of questions? And
yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I've heard a lot of talk recently about, this is actually the current situation. It's not a woman's problem. It's actually a man's problem.
mm-hmm.
But then I guess the danger there is that you're painting all men in the same light, aren't you? And saying, they've got a job to do. But I guess in my story, and you're right to point out the sort of innocent bystander.
Yeah.
Well, he's not, is he?
No.
He's not.
This is why I think your story works so well, because when you have the black and white statements, and I understand why they come out, about all men need to do better, all men need to fix things, etc. I agree with those statements because I understand them. I also understand why some people who don't have or haven't looked at exactly what they mean, because it's human nature, react to them in a way of, whoa, hang on a minute, it's not all men. But the point isn't that all men are perpetrators of this kind of horrible act. The point is that all men and all women have almost certainly been in a scenario where this kind of stuff happens. And lots of men don't speak up or don't try and do anything about it. And because it's a lot rarer for men to be the people who are abused in this situation, and let me make it clear, I realise that it also happens to men too, and far too often. But because it is a lot rarer, there maybe is a responsibility to speak up when something like this is occurring in front of us. But that idea of all men need to do better, when it's as a statement, can jar, and sometimes understandably so, depending on where it comes from. When it's expressed in the way that you did it today as a story, hopefully people understand what it means and then go, oh, that's what they mean by all men.
Yeah. And I'm this has happened accidentally, but the story of Karen evolves. And what I've done during the course of the story is none of the men have a name.
Clever.
Because I want the spotlight to be on the woman, and very often in a narrative, and I'm not saying always, but very often in a narrative, the woman is a response to the man. So I want the women in this story to have the spotlight. And that's and not everybody's going to agree with that, but I don't care. That's what I want for the story. And I think the danger is that you care too much about the response. It's a story.
Yeah.
It will move some people. It will annoy some people, but at least they'll feel something.
That's it.
I don't want to tell a non-event story that doesn't move anybody anywhere.
Well, what's the point of telling it? This is a nice lead on actually to business in some ways, because that's often what businesses do. And when they are communicating their message or even trying to define their brand without assistance from people who know what they're doing, they will define themselves as middle of the road. They won't try and understand what they're genuinely trying to do and therefore how they should communicate their message. Instead, what they will do is go with what they think will have the least resistance. And I feel like if you do that in business or any walk of life, then the chances are you'll just be ignored. And in life in general, maybe being ignored is a good thing. In business, well, you're not going to have a business for very long.
No, and you're absolutely right. And this is kind of one of the themes of the conversations in the mentoring group. And actually, something I said had an impact on him, and it was like a throwaway comment in a little networking room. And he was sort of saying he thought he needed to behave and look in a particular way to please people to get to where he needed to be. And I just said, you just need to be yourself and not worry about the fact that you might be upsetting people, because if you're not pissing somebody off, you're not doing anything.
Yeah, that's it. And it is a challenge because this message is also now fairly popular of, if you, the secondary message you mentioned there, that if you're not pissing somebody off, then you're not doing anything. And it's a message I wholeheartedly agree with. But it's also, in some circles, taken on a worrying tone of, if you're not pissing somebody off, then you're not doing anything. So people then go out to purposely piss people off.
Yeah.
That's also not very beneficial. The point that you're making, and the point that I always try to make, I do not want to speak for you, the point that I believe you are making, and the point that I always try to make, is that just be you. And yeah, that's going to piss people off because not everyone likes everyone else.
No.
But don't actively go out and also try to piss people off, because
that's not my message at all.
I realise that.
My message is be you. Just be who you are in all your glory.
Yeah.
And even if that means sometimes being angry, as when I was growing up, I was angry most of the time, but I just didn't know why. And it's only as time's gone on and I've reflected on it. And some of it is about all this sort of, the stuff that you've got to navigate just to exist that you shouldn't have to navigate.
Yeah.
Of course, that makes you angry.
Yeah.
And I was I was called difficult as I was growing up, but I wasn't difficult. I was just challenging stuff but I didn't know how to do it in an articulate, structured way. So I was just kicking off until I found what the real thing I needed to kick off was.
I imagine also because things have changed over time. Thankfully, I think a lot for the better in most aspects of life. But when you are seen as challenging the status quo, there's maybe a little bit more opportunity to do that in some circles now than there used to be. But for lots of people growing up, if you challenged anything, you were shut down quicker than you could possibly say the third word in your sentence. And so when people called you difficult, it was because they didn't want you to challenge, because they had their opinion and their way forward, and that was the way it was, and there wasn't an opportunity.
Yeah.
Whereas now, would you say there's more opportunity?
I think so. I think so for some people, not for everybody. But it's that using the past to inform the future thing again, isn't it? I've always encouraged debate in my family. The girls they don't have to accept everything that I say. You have a discussion about some stuff. Some stuff you don't have a discussion about. It's life and death, and that's what's happening.
Yeah.
But certainly I've encouraged more debate and discussion. And the difference is I've looked at my girls and thought, you are all just absolutely blooming amazing, all in completely different ways. And I want to celebrate that. I don't want to kind of clone you into something that I think you should be, because why would I do that? You
Exactly.
are fantastic in all your layers and colours, and and they're just them, aren't they? It's been a privilege for me to have had them in my life. And that's kind of the difference. I think in my generation growing up, I think the parental role was kind of to form people into something.
Yes, so society's boundaries, the job of the parent was to try and make sure that the kids that their kids fitted into them. And to an extent that hasn't changed. To an extent that the boundaries have changed, but there's still boundaries, and there's still the idea that we are trying to push people into one particular way of life, into an idea that there are good paths and bad paths rather than there just being paths, which is why I see it, and I imagine that our listeners can hear the utter pride you have for your daughters. And also, there's something interesting I heard about the idea of certain kind of parenting techniques, and I'm not a parent, but I just found it an interesting comment where they mentioned the idea of you can constantly say that you're proud of your children, or you could say, yeah, you should probably be really proud of yourself to your children. And the reason there's a difference in the two sentences, and I mean, it's purely language, and I wouldn't be calling anybody out on the way they speak to their kids. But the reason the second sentence is quite nice is because it's the idea of whatever it is you're doing, you know what, you've got a really good reason to be proud. Doesn't matter if it's different to everyone else, but you have a really good reason to be proud. Don't worry about proving anything to me and whether I'm proud.
Yeah.
You have a really good reason to be proud. I loved that twist. I don't know who said it originally. I think it came from a book, but not one that I've actually read myself. But I just loved the idea.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? And I now have the joy of they turn things back at me as well.
In what way?
By sort of saying the same thing, that they're incredibly proud of me and blah blah blah. Because I had that whole guilt thing, particularly when I was growing my business, my bakery business, and they were quite young, and it was just a challenge, a juggle, a constant juggle. But they would all say now that they're happy that was their life, because it's brought something to them. It's put another dimension on their lives. Yes, and I think that's the challenge of the parent, is that you constantly feel guilty about the stuff you're not doing, but you don't actually acknowledge the stuff that you're doing that's happening right there in front of your face. And it's not just for them. You know, I love it now that I had a message on LinkedIn from one of my youngest daughter's friends they still lost touch now, but they were friends when they were about 10 or 11. And I used to call her golden hair because she had this beautiful blonde hair. She sent me a message on LinkedIn saying, "Hi Viv, it's golden hair here. Can we connect?"
Those little touches,
isn't that? And that's so cute, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, it's brilliant. I absolutely love that. And I think we should maybe have our cake and eat it. I would like to focus a little bit more on the bakery. And you spoke there about the idea that when you had the bakery business, obviously it was busy running a bakery, and you know, you were being pulled in all sorts of different directions, and that's why you sometimes worried about whether or not you were spending enough time. But gladly, as you say, your daughters have said to you since that it was a great learning moments came from that time. But for those who don't know you as well as I've been getting to know you recently, tell us a bit more about the bakery and kind of what kicked it off and how it developed.
Okay, so I'll give you a potted story of that, because that's a whole other book in itself. I just returned to work after being at home with my children, after I sort of had 11 years altogether at home with them, doing the hardest job in the world. 3 strong, independent women who have been that from the day they were born. But that was a joy. I don't regret that for 1 minute. Anyway, I'd given up a career, took 11 years out, the whole world had changed in those 11 years. Technology had kicked in big style. And I'm trying to get myself back to work. So started off just doing some little bookkeeping jobs. And then, long story short, ended up working in a bakery, which was in a big industrial unit in Leeds. Another long story short, that business went into liquidation, and there was an opportunity to buy the business out. So I said to the former director, do you fancy buying it out together?
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, he said no. And then I said, oh, okay, well, I'm probably going to do it anyway.
Right.
And he said, you won't be able to do it without me.
Red rag, right?
Red rag. So off I went, and that was in 2004. And there were 4 people in the bakery. And then in 2015, I left, and it was then turning over 1.6 million, and there were 32 people in there. So it was, we were supplying to food service distribution, so it was a B2B rather than a B2C business.
Okay. But at the same time, the amount of work that has to go into thinking about stories to be able to do all of the stuff that you do now in terms of digging into the finances, working out the data, understanding how that can be used to build the business and to then attract B2B customers, but to help them attract their customers at the same time.
Yeah.
It shows an incredible skill set. It also shows why people now should have the trust that I think I have in how much of a great job you can do for them when you are working at the executive level, and also when you are mentoring freelancers, because you clearly know what you're doing.
Well, hopefully, I think the thing that I will always say is that I can feel your pain, because I've felt that pain. Whereas people who coach and haven't done it, they've no idea. Absolutely no idea.
That leads on nicely to what the third point was going to be, which is that it shows your resilience and it shows your strength. Because being in a place where someone tells you, no, you can't do something, and everything seems to be, the business went into liquidation. It wasn't exactly a golden goose. But yet you went, nah, I'm going to try. I'm going to see what happens.
Yeah, well, what was there to lose? There's nothing to lose. The worst thing would be not to try, wouldn't it?
Exactly. And so I think that is a great lesson for lots of people. And I think it's a nice point to maybe have a final word on you and where people can find you if they would like potentially mentoring support, if they would like help with their businesses, or if they, as I quite often do now, would just like to chat with you because you're wonderful. Where can they find you?
Thanks. So I have a website, which is beamazingLTD.com, and I spend quite a bit of time on LinkedIn also, which is just rambling away, telling stories, just putting pictures of my stupid face up there. And I'm Viv J. Parry on LinkedIn. So feel free to connect on there. I prefer it if people put a message when they send me a connection request. Just a little foible.
I think that'll be lovely, and also that could be a nice little boost for this podcast if people hear you on here. They can say where they found you. What I would also suggest as well, and we'll put this onto the show notes, is that I know we mentioned this earlier, but everybody go and listen to Viv's podcast, Be Amazing at Home. It's brilliant. It's well worth the listen. Obviously, once you have listened to all of our episodes of the Storytelling with Buck podcast.
Yes, of course. Yeah, and it's not, there's not a particular theme. It's just, I started it right at the beginning of the first lockdown, that's like 300 years ago. The idea was just that I know a bunch of people, and it was just conversations. So an opportunity for people to sort of eavesdrop in the way that you would when you used to be able to go to the pub and stuff.
Brilliant, brilliant. Now, on that nice note of people going to the pub, sadly, it's not something that you can all do right now, but I think it's a great time to end the conversation, and you can have a beer at home, at least if you're listening in the evening.
It's Friday. Do what you like.
Exactly. But Viv, thank you so much for joining us today on the Storytelling with Puck podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And we will, as always, end the podcast with a Puck creation story. Who are we to choose our fate, to walk our own path, to find our place? Who are we to push through doors, to dream a dream that dreams are more? Who are we to hold out hope, to believe we will win, we won't just cope? Who are we to stand our ground, to face our demons, to shut them down? We are whomever we want to be. We are the vision that we see. We are who we are, and we are strong. We are individuals. We are never alone. You've just been listening to the Storytelling with Puck podcast. We'll be back very soon, so make sure you subscribe and catch up on any of the episodes you've missed.